In the autumn of 1994, in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Virginia, a little girl disappeared without a trace, and police found no evidence. But 21 years later, a hidden clue came to light, and it uncovered a truth no one was prepared for. The city of Salem, Virginia, sits nestled beautifully in the Roanoke Valley, surrounded by the towering, majestic peaks of the Blue Ridge Mountains. In the mid-1990s, it was the definition of a safe, idyllic American community. It was a place where autumn brought vibrant orange and red leaves that blanketed the wide sidewalks, where neighbors borrowed sugar without asking, and where families left their front porch lights burning long into the quiet night. For Thomas and Evelyn Gallagher, this peaceful valley was the absolute perfect place to build their lives and raise their two children. Thomas was a dedicated, deeply patient high school science teacher at the local public school. He was a tall, gentle man with a warm laugh and a perpetual smudge of chalk on his trousers. Evelyn was the creative heartbeat of the family, working as a highly sought-after baker who ran a small, bustling pastry shop on Main Street. Together, they had built a home filled with the rich smells of vanilla, the quiet hum of the evening news, and an abundance of unconditional love. Their eldest child, 10-year-old Nolan, was a fiercely protective, highly observant boy. He worshipped his father and spent his weekends building model airplanes on the living room carpet. But Nolan's primary role in life, a duty he took with absolute seriousness, was being a big brother to his 6-year-old sister, Hazel. Hazel was a radiant, joyful little girl who possessed an imagination that could fill a stadium. She had a messy mop of bright, curly brown hair, a slight, adorable gap between her front teeth, and a pair of large, highly expressive green eyes. She was a child who believed in magic, who thought the fireflies in the backyard were tiny fairies, and who treated every day as a massive, wonderful adventure. But out of all the toys and treasures Hazel possessed, there was one item she loved above all else. It was a handmade teddy bear named Barnaby. Barnaby was not purchased at a standard toy store. He was meticulously, lovingly hand-stitched by Evelyn's late mother just weeks before she passed away. Because the grandmother's eyesight had been failing, the bear was beautifully imperfect. Barnaby was made of soft, faded brown corduroy fabric. He had a distinct, bright blue velvet patch sewn over his chest, and his left eye was a mismatched, oversized wooden button. But the most important feature of Barnaby was a small, brilliant secret that the grandmother had added just for Hazel. Carefully hidden in the stitching along the very back of the bear, completely invisible to the naked eye, was a small, 4-inch pocket secured by a thin strip of Velcro. The grandmother had told Hazel that it was a secret vault, a place to hide her most valuable childhood treasures. Hazel took this to heart. She carried Barnaby everywhere she went, holding him tightly by his worn corduroy paw, constantly tucking small, shiny pebbles, folded drawings, and shiny pennies into his secret back pocket. The second week of November in 1994 brought a sudden, violent shift in the weather. The crisp, cool autumn air clashed aggressively with a warm front moving up from the south, creating the perfect conditions for a massive, rolling Appalachian thunderstorm. On the evening of Friday, November 11, the sky over Salem turned a deep, bruised shade of purple. The wind began to howl aggressively through the tall oak trees, rattling the window panes of the Gallagher home. By 8 o'clock at night, the heavy, blinding rain began to fall in sheets, accompanied by loud, ground-shaking cracks of thunder. Hazel was absolutely terrified of thunderstorms. She was sitting in the center of her bedroom floor, wearing a pair of yellow flannel pajamas, clutching Barnaby tightly against her chest. Her bedroom was a warm, comforting space, painted a soft shade of peach, with a large window that looked out over the sprawling, fenced-in backyard. At 8:30, a massive, deafening crack of thunder shook the entire foundation of the house, causing the electricity to flicker violently for a few terrifying seconds. Hazel let out a small whimper, burying her face into Barnaby's soft brown fur. A moment later, her bedroom door creaked open. It was Nolan. He was holding a small, battery-powered flashlight. He walked into his sister's room, sitting down on the carpet right next to her. He put his arm around her small, trembling shoulders, assuring her that the thunder was just the clouds bumping into each other in the dark. But Hazel was still shaking, her wide green eyes darting nervously toward the rain-streaked window. Nolan, possessing a deep, incredible empathy for a 10-year-old boy, reached into the front pocket of his denim jeans. He pulled out his absolute most prized, valuable possession in the entire world. It was a mint condition, 1989 Ken Griffey Jr. rookie baseball card. It was securely protected inside a thick, clear, hard plastic sleeve. Nolan had saved his allowance for months to buy it from a local hobby shop, and he polished the plastic case every single day. Nolan held the baseball card out in the dim light of the bedroom. He looked at Hazel with a completely serious, highly convincing expression. "Do you know what this is?" Nolan whispered, shining the flashlight onto the glossy card. "This is a magic shield. Ken Griffey Jr. hits home runs so hard they can knock the thunder right out of the sky. If you keep this with you tonight, absolutely nothing bad can get into your room. It will protect you." Hazel's eyes widened with awe. She gently took the hard plastic case from her brother's hand, looking at the baseball player printed on the front. She smiled, feeling a massive wave of comfort wash over her. She turned Barnaby over, carefully pulled the hidden Velcro seam apart on his back, and slipped the plastic baseball card deep into the soft cotton stuffing. She pressed the Velcro shut, hiding the magic shield perfectly. Just a few minutes later, Evelyn and Thomas walked into the bedroom. They smiled warmly at the sight of their two children sitting together on the floor. Thomas picked Hazel up, tossing her gently into the air, making her giggle loudly, before placing her under the warm, heavy blankets of her bed. Evelyn tucked the quilt tightly around her daughter's shoulders, kissing her softly on the forehead. Hazel was holding Barnaby securely under her chin. She looked up at her parents, her fear of the storm entirely gone, replaced by the profound, absolute safety of a loving home. "Good night, Mommy." "Good night, Daddy," Hazel murmured, her eyes already growing heavy. "Good night, our sweet girl," Evelyn whispered softly. "We love you." Thomas turned on a small, rotating nightlight that projected tiny yellow stars onto the ceiling. He walked out of the room with Evelyn and Nolan, pulling the heavy wooden bedroom door shut until it was only cracked open an inch. The Gallagher family went to sleep, the heavy rain masking all the sounds of the night, completely unaware that their beautiful, perfect life was about to be entirely destroyed. The next morning, Nolan was the first person to wake up. The violent thunderstorm had completely passed, leaving behind a cold, silent, misty Saturday morning. The sun had not yet broken through the heavy gray clouds. Nolan walked out of his bedroom, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, expecting to smell the rich aroma of his mother brewing coffee in the kitchen. But the house was completely, entirely silent. And more noticeably, the house was absolutely freezing. A bitter, damp chill had settled heavily into the hallways. Nolan shivered in his pajamas and walked slowly down the wooden staircase. He reached the bottom step and looked toward the back of the house, where the kitchen connected to the rear patio. The heavy wooden back door of the kitchen was standing wide open. The damp, freezing morning wind was blowing aggressively through the doorway, carrying wet autumn leaves directly onto the kitchen linoleum. The door was swaying slightly on its hinges, creaking softly in the quiet house. Nolan felt a sudden, deep spike of confusion and fear. His parents were incredibly strict about locking the doors at night. He ran to the bottom of the stairs and yelled for his father. Thomas and Evelyn rushed out of their master bedroom, instantly sensing the panic in their son's voice. When Thomas saw the open back door, he immediately ran into the kitchen, his heart hammering in his chest. He checked the deadbolt. The lock had not been forced or broken. It had been smoothly, quietly turned from the inside. Evelyn didn't wait. A massive, crushing sense of maternal dread completely paralyzed her lungs. She turned around and sprinted violently back up the stairs, running directly toward her daughter's room. She pushed the door open, calling Hazel's name. The bedroom was completely empty. The heavy quilt was thrown carelessly onto the floor. The rotating nightlight was still casting faint yellow stars onto the ceiling in the gray morning light, but Hazel was completely gone. Evelyn fell to her knees, screaming for Thomas. She tore the blankets off the bed, checked under the mattress, and frantically threw open the closet doors, praying that her daughter was just playing a game of hide-and-seek. But there was absolutely no sign of the 6-year-old girl. And as Nolan stood in the doorway, his eyes wide with absolute, primal terror, he noticed the one detail that made his stomach drop completely. Barnaby was also gone. Before we continue, if this story has kept you watching, please subscribe. Your support truly means a lot to us. Within 15 minutes, the quiet suburban street was flooded with the flashing red and blue lights of half a dozen Salem police cruisers. The sheer panic in Thomas's voice on the 911 call had triggered an immediate, massive emergency response. Heavily armed officers swarmed the property, tapping off the front yard and establishing a rigid perimeter. The lead investigator assigned to the scene was Detective Callum Vance. Vance was a highly respected, deeply methodical veteran of the force. He was a father of 3 daughters himself, and missing children cases always hit him with a heavy, devastating emotional weight. When he walked through the front door of the Gallagher home, the sheer atmospheric grief in the living room was suffocating. Evelyn was sitting on the sofa, rocking back and forth, weeping so heavily she could barely draw breath. Thomas was packing frantically, his face entirely pale, demanding the officers search the woods behind their fence. Vance walked carefully into the kitchen, observing the open back door. The forensic team was already dusting the brass doorknob and the heavy wooden frame. Vance knelt down on the cold linoleum floor, shining a bright tactical flashlight across the ground. There were muddy footprints on the kitchen floor. They were large, heavy boot prints, completely unidentifiable in their brand, trailing from the back door, across the kitchen, and directly toward the front hallway stairs. But as Vance followed the muddy tracks outside onto the back patio, the terrifying reality of the weather became painfully clear. The massive, torrential thunderstorm had completely washed the patio, the grass, and the driveway entirely clean. The heavy rain had acted as a perfect, natural eraser. There were no tire tracks in the gravel, no footprints in the mud near the fence, and absolutely no physical evidence pointing to which direction the predator had gone. Vance walked upstairs and entered Hazel's peach-colored bedroom. He looked at the empty bed, his jaw clenching with a fierce, burning anger. A predator had walked into a locked house in the middle of a massive thunderstorm, completely bypassed a sleeping family, taken a 6-year-old girl directly from her bed, and walked out the back door without making a single, detectable sound. How did the attacker get inside a locked house without breaking a window or forcing a door? Why did they specifically target Hazel? The terrifying, unanswerable questions hung heavily in the freezing morning air, completely paralyzing the initial investigation before it had even begun. The complete lack of physical damage to the heavy wooden back door created an immediate, terrifying puzzle for the Salem Police Department. Detective Callum Vance stood in the freezing kitchen, his seasoned eyes scanning the smooth brass doorknob and the perfectly intact deadbolt. A violent home invasion usually involves shattered glass, splintered door frames, or pried windows, but this was quiet, calculated, and terrifyingly seamless. Vance walked into the living room, where Thomas and Evelyn were sitting close together on the sofa, holding onto each other as if they were drowning. Vance kept his voice incredibly gentle, asking them a question that usually breaks a family's sense of absolute safety. He asked if they kept a spare house key hidden anywhere on the property. Thomas looked up, his eyes bloodshot and wide with sudden realization. He told the detective that they kept a single, brass spare key hidden inside a hollow, fake plastic rock, tucked deeply beneath a large hydrangea bush in the front garden. It was only there for emergencies, in case Nolan ever locked himself out after school. Vance immediately dispatched a forensic technician to the front yard. The technician knelt in the wet, muddy mulch beneath the front windows, carefully pulling the hollow plastic rock from beneath the branches. When the technician opened the plastic rock, the spare brass key was sitting perfectly inside. But as the forensic team dusted the key and the plastic rock for fingerprints, a deep, sickening chill washed over Detective Vance. The key and the fake rock were completely, flawlessly wiped clean. There was absolutely no dirt, no natural outdoor grime, and not a single partial fingerprint on the brass metal. The intruder had not randomly stumbled upon the Gallagher home. The predator had known exactly where the secret spare key was hidden. They had walked through the freezing thunderstorm, retrieved the key, unlocked the back door, and meticulously wiped the evidence completely clean before putting it back into the garden. This meant the kidnapper was not a passing drifter. It was someone who had been watching the family very closely, or even worse, it was someone they already knew and trusted. While the police began to process the terrifying implications of the spare key, the emotional devastation inside the house was reaching a breaking point. Evelyn slowly walked upstairs, her legs trembling so violently she had to hold onto the wooden banister. She walked into Hazel's peach-colored bedroom and collapsed onto the empty bed. She pulled Hazel's yellow flannel pillow to her chest, burying her face in the fabric, inhaling the lingering, sweet scent of her daughter's shampoo. She wept with a loud, agonizing intensity that echoed painfully through the entire house. Thomas followed her, wrapping his large arms around his wife, completely unable to stop his own heavy tears from falling. But sitting alone on the floor of the hallway, entirely crushed by a massive, unimaginable burden of guilt, was 10-year-old Nolan. Detective Vance noticed the young boy shaking quietly in the hallway. Vance, a father himself, knew exactly how much collateral damage a tragedy like this caused to siblings. He unbuckled his heavy police radio, took off his wet jacket, and knelt down on the carpet so he was perfectly at eye level with the terrified 10-year-old. Nolan looked up at the detective, tears completely flooding his eyes. His voice cracked into a desperate, heartbreaking whisper as he confessed exactly what had happened the night before. Nolan explained how he had given his sister the Magic Ken Griffey Jr. rookie card. He told the detective how he had promised her that the baseball card was a shield and that it would absolutely protect her from anything bad in the dark. "My shield didn't work," Nolan sobbed, wiping his eyes with the sleeves of his pajamas. "I told her she was safe and I let somebody take her." Vance felt a heavy, painful lump form in his own throat. He reached out and placed his large, warm hand securely on Nolan's shoulder. He looked the boy directly in the eyes and promised him with absolute certainty that this was not his fault. But as Nolan continued to speak through his tears, he gave the detective the most critical, highly specific piece of identifying evidence in the entire investigation. Nolan explained that he had watched Hazel hide the hard plastic baseball card inside the secret, hidden Velcro pocket on the back of Barnaby, her handmade corduroy teddy bear. Vance instantly realized the massive importance of this detail. A little girl in yellow pajamas can be difficult to spot in the dark, but a handmade, faded brown corduroy teddy bear with a blue velvet chest patch, a mismatched wooden button for an eye, and a valuable, mint-condition baseball card hidden securely inside its back pocket was an incredibly unique, undeniable signature. Vance immediately ran down the stairs and issued a massive, statewide law enforcement bulletin. He ordered every single patrol officer, state trooper, and highway patrol unit across Virginia to look for the specific handmade bear. If they found Barnaby, they would find the monster who took Hazel. The initial search effort launched by the Salem community was one of the largest and most desperate in the history of the Roanoke Valley. Thousands of local volunteers, Off-duty firefighters and concerned parents descended on the neighborhood. They wore heavy winter coats and bright orange hunting vests, forming massive, shoulder-to-shoulder grid lines. They marched slowly through the dense, freezing pine forests of the Blue Ridge Mountains. They used long wooden walking sticks to poke through the thick, wet layers of fallen autumn leaves. The state police deployed low-flying helicopters equipped with advanced thermal imaging cameras, desperately sweeping the cold, winding currents of the Roanoke River, searching for any signs of body heat in the freezing water. A highly specialized team of search and rescue bloodhounds was brought in from the state capitol. The handlers allowed the heavy dogs to smell one of Hazel's unwashed sweaters, unleashing them at the open back door of the kitchen. But the brutal, torrential thunderstorm from the night before had completely destroyed any chance of tracking the predator. The millions of gallons of heavy rain had washed away every single microscopic skin cell and scent molecule. The dogs walked in confused circles on the wet grass, whining softly, entirely unable to pick up a trail. With the physical search grid failing to produce a single piece of evidence, Detective Vance and his team turned their intense focus onto the people surrounding the Gallagher family. The fact that the intruder knew exactly where the spare key was hidden meant the suspect pool was highly specific. The police established a command center at the local precinct and began conducting hundreds of exhausting, deeply invasive interviews. They sat down with Thomas and Evelyn, gently but firmly walking them through their entire social circle. They interviewed the babysitters, the neighbors who lived on their street, the regular customers at Evelyn's pastry shop, and the teachers at Nolan's elementary school. They pulled the financial records of the family, looking for massive debts, hidden gambling problems, or angry business partners. But Thomas and Evelyn were exactly what they appeared to be, a kind, hardworking, deeply normal couple with absolutely no dark secrets. The detectives aggressively tracked down every single registered violent offender living within a 50-mile radius of the Roanoke Valley. They dragged men out of their beds in the middle of the night, checking their alibis, inspecting the tires on their vehicles, and searching their homes for any sign of a little girl in yellow pajamas or a corduroy teddy bear. But every single lead turned into a massive, unyielding brick wall. Every neighbor had a solid alibi. Every known offender was accounted for. The local pawn shops had not seen anyone trying to sell a rare Ken Griffey Jr. rookie card. The predator had operated with a terrifying, phantom-like precision, slipping into the dark house, taking a beloved child, and completely vanishing off the face of the earth. As the days slowly turned into weeks, the freezing Virginia winter began to settle heavily over the valley. The massive crowds of volunteers slowly began to dwindle as people were forced to return to their jobs and their own families. The bright yellow missing person flyers taped to the storefronts on Main Street began to fade in the harsh winter sun, their edges curling and tearing in the freezing wind, until Hazel's smiling face was barely visible. The emotional toll on the Gallagher family was absolute, crushing devastation. The warm, happy home they had built transformed into a silent, suffocating museum of ambiguous loss. Evelyn could not bring herself to return to the pastry shop. She spent her days sitting in the peach-colored bedroom, staring blankly out the window. Thomas tried desperately to hold his family together, but he was completely breaking apart inside. He spent his nights driving endlessly up and down the dark rural highways of the county, shining a heavy spotlight into the dark woods, completely unable to accept that his daughter was just gone. The investigation was officially grinding to a painful, agonizing halt. The police had absolutely no suspects, no vehicles identified, and no physical evidence. It seemed as though the monster who had taken Hazel had committed the absolute perfect crime. Before we continue, if this story has kept you watching, please subscribe. Your support truly means a lot to us. Exactly 3 weeks after Hazel disappeared, on a quiet, freezing Tuesday morning, a new piece of evidence finally surfaced. It did not come from a police search. and it did not come from a forensic laboratory. It came from a retired 70-year-old man named Arthur Pendleton, who lived on a high, elevated ridge that directly overlooked the Gallagher's suburban neighborhood. Arthur was an avid amateur photographer. He spent his retirement studying weather patterns and taking high-resolution, long-exposure photographs of massive lightning storms rolling across the Blue Ridge Mountains. On the night of November 11, during the massive thunderstorm, Arthur had been sitting on his covered back porch with his camera mounted on a heavy tripod, capturing the violent purple lightning strikes illuminating the valley below. Because he processed and developed his own film in a small, dark basement laboratory, it had taken him several weeks to finally get around to developing that specific roll of film. Arthur sat in his darkroom, bathed in the eerie red safety lights, gently swirling the heavy photographic paper in a tray of chemical developer. He watched as the images slowly began to appear on the paper. Most of the photographs were simply beautiful, highly contrasted shots of the dark clouds and the jagged streaks of electricity. But as Arthur developed a specific photograph taken at exactly 8:45 in the evening, the exact time frame when Hazel was being tucked into bed, he noticed something deeply strange in the background of the shot. Arthur pulled the wet photograph out of the chemical bath and hung it on a wire string to dry. He grabbed a heavy magnifying glass and leaned closely over the image. The photograph captured a massive, brilliant flash of lightning that perfectly illuminated the sprawling residential neighborhood below his ridge. Arthur could clearly see the roof of the Gallagher house in the distance. But directly behind the Gallagher's backyard fence, parked illegally on the narrow, unpaved utility access road that ran between the neighborhoods, was a vehicle. It was a heavy, commercial-style panel van. It was sitting completely in the dark, with its headlights turned entirely off, perfectly hidden in the shadows of the tall oak trees. Arthur's heart began to race. He knew about the missing little girl, and he knew that the police were desperate for any leads. He immediately placed the dry photograph into a protective manila envelope and drove his truck directly to the Salem Police Precinct, handing the evidence directly to Detective Callum Vance. When Vance looked at the photograph under his own heavy magnifying glass, a massive, electric jolt of adrenaline shot completely through his chest. The amateur photographer had captured a predator hiding in the dark, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Vance quickly sent the photograph to the State Police Digital Enhancement Laboratory. The forensic technicians scanned the original film negative, using advanced computer software to increase the contrast and pull the hidden details out of the deep shadows of the storm. 2 hours later, the laboratory technician brought a highly enlarged, perfectly clear version of the photograph into the briefing room and laid it flat on the wooden table. Vance stared at the image, his breath catching in his throat. The enhanced lightning strike illuminated the side of the heavy commercial van perfectly. And painted directly onto the heavy metal side panel of the dark van, faded but entirely readable in the flash of the storm, was the distinct, highly recognizable logo of a specific residential heating and insulation company. It was the exact same contracting company that Thomas Gallagher had hired to replace the insulation in their attic, just 2 months before Hazel disappeared. The undeniable proof sitting on the wooden table sent Detective Callum Vance into an immediate, highly aggressive sprint. The connection was absolutely flawless. A contractor working in the attic just 2 months prior would have had full access to the property. They could have easily looked out the second-story window, watching Thomas Gallagher hide the spare brass key under the fake plastic rock in the front garden. They would know the layout of the house, the exact location of the children's bedrooms, and how to navigate the creaking wooden floorboards in the dark. Vance and a team of heavily armed detectives drove aggressively across town, pulling their cruisers directly up to the front doors of the commercial heating and insulation company. The owner of the business, a deeply terrified, older man, immediately surrendered his entire filing cabinet of employee records. Vance threw the files onto the front desk, desperately searching for the specific work order tied to the Gallagher house in September of 1994. The paperwork revealed that a two-man crew had spent 3 days installing heavy fiberglass insulation in the Gallagher's attic. The first man was the crew foreman, an elderly man who was currently sitting in a wheelchair in a local nursing home following a severe stroke. The second man was a 25-year-old independent subcontractor named Elias Cobb. Vance pulled the background file on Elias Cobb. The physical and psychological profile was absolutely terrifying. Cobb was a large, heavily built man with a long, deeply disturbing history of aggressive behavior. He had a string of arrests for stalking and breaking into houses, though he had consistently managed to avoid serious prison time due to a lack of solid physical evidence. He was exactly the type of predator who would watch a family, memorize their routines, and use a massive thunderstorm as the perfect cover to invade their home. Vance authorized an immediate, overwhelming tactical raid on Cobb's residence. A massive convoy of blacked-out police cruisers descended on a rundown, highly isolated trailer park on the outskirts of the Roanoke Valley. The SWAT team kicked in the flimsy metal door of Cobb's trailer, violently pinning the large man to the dirty linoleum floor. They tore the trailer completely apart, bringing in the search and rescue bloodhounds, desperately looking for Hazel, yellow pajamas, or a brown corduroy teddy bear. But the trailer was entirely empty. Vance dragged Elias Cobb into the small, windowless interrogation room at the precinct. He threw the digitally enhanced photograph of the commercial van parked in the dark woods onto the metal table. He leaned directly into Cobb's face, his voice roaring with a desperate, unyielding fury, demanding to know where the little girl was hidden. Elias Cobb did not blink. He looked at the photograph, and then he leaned back in his heavy metal chair, a cold, deeply arrogant smirk spreading across his weathered face. Cobb calmly explained that he had absolutely nothing to do with the disappearance. He told the detective to look at the official police dispatch records from the night of November 11. Vance immediately grabbed the telephone and called the dispatch archives. The response from the records clerk completely paralyzed the entire investigation. Elias Cobb's alibi was a flawless, unbreakable brick wall. At exactly 7 o'clock on the evening of the thunderstorm, a full hour before Hazel was tucked into bed, Elias Cobb had called 911 to report that his commercial work van had been stolen from the parking lot of a local diner. The police had officially taken his statement and filed the grand theft auto report while the storm was raging. 3 days later, the stolen van was found completely abandoned in a deep, muddy ditch nearly 50 miles away. The interior of the vehicle had been intentionally doused in gasoline and set on fire. The intense flames had entirely destroyed any microscopic DNA, fingerprints, or physical evidence that might have been left inside. Cobb was legally untouchable. The police strongly suspected that Cobb had staged the theft himself, parking the van in the woods, committing the crime, and then burning the vehicle to destroy the evidence. But without a single witness, without a confession, and without the little girl, a suspicion is entirely worthless in a court of law. The district attorney flatly refused to press charges, citing the documented police report of the stolen vehicle. Elias Cobb walked out of the Salem police precinct a completely free man, leaving Detective Vance standing in the hallway, entirely devoid of any other leads. The brutal, agonizing reality of a cold case slowly settled heavily over the Gallagher family. The massive brick wall completely stalled the investigation. The heavy winter snow eventually melted into spring, completely erasing any microscopic clues that might have been left in the Roanoke woods. The police had absolutely no other suspects, and the massive files were quietly moved into a locked metal cabinet in the archives. 21 long, agonizing years passed. The world completely transformed, leaving 1994 far behind as a distant, heartbreaking memory. Thomas and Evelyn Gallagher survived, but they were forever changed. They moved out of the house in Salem, completely unable to walk past the empty peach-colored bedroom without breaking down. They relocated to a quiet, small home in the countryside, leaning heavily on each other to endure the quiet torture of the unknown. They never stopped leaving their front porch light on every single night, desperately holding onto a tiny, fragile thread of hope that Hazel might somehow find her way out of the dark. But it was Nolan who completely dedicated his entire life to the pursuit of the truth. Nolan was now 31 years old. He had grown into a sharp, fiercely determined and deeply empathetic man. Driven entirely by the heavy, crushing guilt of the magic baseball card failing to protect his little sister, Nolan had become an elite, highly respected private investigator. He possessed a brilliant, analytical mind and an absolute refusal to let the case go. His small, incredibly organized office in downtown Roanoke was completely covered in corkboards, maps, and decades of old police files. Every single night, after finishing his normal cases, Nolan would sit at his heavy wooden desk, drinking black coffee, and meticulously comb through the modern internet. Nolan knew that physical evidence was the only way to break Elias Cobb's alibi, and he knew that the key to the entire case was not Elias Cobb himself. The key was a faded brown corduroy teddy bear with a blue velvet patch, a mismatched wooden button eye, and a mint-condition 1989 Ken Griffey Jr. rookie card hidden inside a secret Velcro pocket. Nolan created massive, automated digital alerts across every single online auction site, vintage toy forum, and digital estate sale database in the country. He searched for any mention of the baseball card or the handmade bear, desperate for the monster to make a single, careless mistake and try to sell the items. For 21 years, the internet remained completely silent. Then, on a quiet, freezing Tuesday night in December of 2015, exactly 21 years after Hazel vanished into the storm, a single digital alert finally popped up on Nolan's computer monitor. Nolan clicked the alert. It directed him to a highly obscure, poorly designed online auction website operated by a rural estate liquidation company. The company was based in a deeply isolated, heavily wooded region of southern West Virginia, nearly 3 hours across the state line from the Roanoke Valley. The liquidation company had just uploaded a massive gallery of photographs from a recent estate cleanout. They were auctioning off the remaining contents of an old, abandoned farmhouse. Nolan scrolled through dozens of blurry, poorly lit photographs of old furniture, rusting farm equipment, and stacks of dusty books. He clicked on a photograph labeled as miscellaneous children's toys. The picture showed a large, dirty cardboard box filled with old wooden blocks and faded plastic dolls. But sitting directly on top of the pile, partially obscured by a layer of heavy dust, was a handmade teddy bear. Nolan completely froze. The coffee mug in his hand slipped, shattering violently against the wooden floorboards of his office. He leaned incredibly close to his glowing monitor, his heart suddenly pounding a frantic, terrifying rhythm against his ribcage. He used his mouse to zoom deeply into the blurry, low-resolution photograph. The bear was made of faded brown corduroy fabric. Sewn directly over the chest was a highly distinct, bright blue velvet patch, and staring back at the camera was a single, oversized, mismatched wooden button eye. It was Barnaby. Nolan's hands were shaking so violently he could barely type. He didn't wait for the online auction to officially begin, and he didn't call the local police. If he involved law enforcement now, bureaucratic red tape could slow the process down by days, and the bear could be sold and shipped to a random buyer across the country. Nolan grabbed his heavy winter coat, his car keys, and a thick envelope of emergency cash from his desk drawer. He ran down the stairs of his office building, jumped into his vehicle, and drove aggressively into the pitch-black, freezing night, speeding toward the West Virginia border. He drove for 3 intense, agonizing hours, winding his way through the steep, dark mountain roads of the Appalachians. He arrived at the small, rural town just as the sun was beginning to peek over the snow-covered peaks, casting a pale, cold light over the valley. The estate liquidation company was operating out of a massive, freezing metal warehouse on the edge of town. Nolan parked his car and walked directly through the front doors, completely ignoring the closed sign hanging in the window. The owner of the company, an older man wearing a thick flannel shirt, looked up from his desk, deeply confused by the intense, exhausted young man standing in his warehouse at dawn. Nolan didn't explain the tragic history. He pulled the thick envelope of cash from his pocket, dropping $500 directly onto the man's desk. He demanded to buy the cardboard box of miscellaneous children's toys from the recent estate cleanout, immediately and without question. The owner, seeing the massive stack of cash, gladly accepted the offer. He walked into the back of the freezing warehouse and returned carrying the heavy, dirty cardboard box, placing it directly into Nolan's trembling hands. Nolan carried the box out to his car. He placed it carefully on the passenger seat and climbed into the driver's side, slamming the heavy door shut against the freezing winter wind. The silence inside the car was incredibly heavy, pressing against his eardrums like a physical weight. Nolan reached into the cardboard box. His gloved fingers gently brushed against the faded brown corduroy fabric. He slowly pulled the teddy bear out of the box, holding it up in the pale morning light. It was perfectly intact, though heavy with the smell of old dust and damp wood. The blue velvet patch was worn, and the wooden button eye was slightly loose. A massive, agonizing wave of emotional devastation washed completely over Nolan. He instantly remembered sitting on the floor of the peach-colored bedroom, telling his little sister that the magic shield would protect her. He closed his eyes, heavy tears finally spilling over his cheeks. But he needed absolute, undeniable proof. Before we continue, if this story has kept you watching, please subscribe. Your support truly means a lot to us. Nolan carefully turned the corduroy bear over. He ran his fingers along the very back of the toy, searching for the invisible seam his grandmother had meticulously stitched 21 years ago. He found the thin strip of Velcro. He pulled it gently apart, the ripping sound echoing loudly in the quiet car. Nolan reached 2 fingers deep into the soft cotton stuffing of the secret 4-inch pocket. His fingers brushed against something completely solid and flat. He slowly pulled the object out of the stuffing and held it up in the light. It was a thick, clear, hard plastic protective sleeve. Sitting perfectly preserved inside the plastic, completely untouched by the passage of 21 years, was the mint-condition 1989 Ken Griffey Jr. rookie baseball card. It was the magic shield. The proof was absolute and undeniable. This was Hazel's bear. Nolan wept openly, clutching the baseball card to his chest. But as he wiped the tears from his eyes, he noticed something deeply strange about the secret pocket on the back of the bear. The Velcro seam was slightly bulging, as if the baseball card was not the only thing hidden inside the small cotton vault. Nolan's heart began to race. He reached his trembling fingers back into the dark pocket. Deep inside the stuffing, pushed all the way to the very bottom of the pouch, his fingers wrapped around a small, tightly folded piece of heavy paper. He pulled it out. It was a heavy, yellowed piece of paper, deeply creased from being folded over dozens of times. It looked exactly like a piece of commercial junk mail or a heavy utility bill. Nolan carefully, meticulously unfolded the fragile, yellowed paper, completely terrified of tearing it. When he smoothed the paper out across his steering wheel and read the heavy black ink printed on the top of the page, the breath permanently left his lungs. It was a highly specific, officially stamped property tax notice from the year 1995, and printed perfectly clearly in the center of the document was the full legal name and the exact, isolated rural address of the monster who had kept his sister. But the name printed on the paper was not Elias Cobb. The heavy, yellowed piece of property tax paper completely shattered the entire 21-year history of the investigation. Nolan sat in the freezing driver's seat of his car, his breath plumbing in the cold morning air, staring at the heavy black ink printed across the top of the official document. The name on the West Virginia tax notice was Arthur Pendleton. Nolan's brilliant, analytical mind began to race violently, pulling decades of old police reports, witness statements, and neighborhood maps from his memory. Arthur Pendleton was the friendly, 70-year-old retired amateur photographer who lived on the high, elevated ridge directly overlooking the Gallagher's suburban neighborhood. He was the man who had magically produced the perfectly timed photograph of Elias Cobb's commercial heating van parked in the dark woods on the night of the massive thunderstorm. The terrifying, absolute brilliance of the predator's deception suddenly snapped perfectly into place. Arthur Pendleton did not accidentally capture a picture of a kidnapper. Arthur Pendleton was the kidnapper. He lived alone on the ridge with high-powered cameras and telephoto lenses. He spent his days quietly watching the neighborhood below. He was the one who watched Thomas Gallagher hide the brass spare key under the fake plastic rock in the front garden. He knew the layout of the house. He knew exactly which bedroom belonged to the little girl in the yellow pajamas. On the night of the massive thunderstorm, Arthur had executed a flawless, deeply calculated masterclass in misdirection. He drove into town and stole Elias Cobb's commercial work van from the diner parking lot. He drove the stolen van to the unpaved utility access road and parked it directly behind the Gallagher's backyard fence. Then Arthur walked back up the hill to his own covered porch, set up his tripod, and took the long-exposure photograph of the stolen van illuminated by a lightning strike. Only after creating his fake evidence did Arthur walk down to the house, retrieve the spare key, and walk silently into the peach-colored bedroom. He took Hazel, loaded her into the stolen van, drove 50 miles away, and burned the vehicle to ash in a muddy ditch, completely destroying any of his own DNA. He had framed a known violent offender flawlessly, completely protecting himself while manipulating the entire Salem Police Department into looking exactly where he wanted them to look. But Arthur Pendleton had made one single, fatal mistake. He had deeply underestimated the brilliance of a terrified 6-year-old girl. Nolan looked down at the teddy bear sitting on the passenger seat. Sometime during her captivity, Hazel must have found a piece of Arthur's discarded mail, a property tax notice linking his name to a secret, rural address in West Virginia. Knowing that Barnaby had a secret pocket that nobody else knew about, she had carefully folded the paper and stuffed it deep behind the hard plastic baseball card. She had created a desperate, hidden distress signal, placing it entirely inside her magic shield, praying that one day her big brother would find it. Nolan shoved the tax document into his jacket pocket. He threw his car door open, sprinting back across the freezing parking lot and bursting violently through the front doors of the estate liquidation warehouse. The older owner looked up from his desk, startled by Nolan's sudden, aggressive return. Nolan slammed his hands flat against the wooden desk, his eyes wide with a frantic, desperate intensity. "The man who owned the estate where you found this box," Nolan demanded, his voice shaking with pure adrenaline. "Arthur Pendleton, where is he right now?" The liquidator frowned, leaning back in his chair. "He's dead, son. Old man Pendleton died of a massive heart attack about 3.5 weeks ago. He was a complete hermit, had no family, no next of kin. The county hired us to go up to his old mountain property and clear the junk out of the farmhouse so the bank can sell the land." A massive, suffocating wave of absolute horror crashed over Nolan, completely paralyzing his lungs. If Arthur Pendleton had died completely alone of a heart attack nearly a month ago, and Hazel was still locked away somewhere on his isolated property. She had been entirely without food, water, or heat for over 3 weeks. The agonizing reality of a cold case had instantly transformed into a terrifying, rapidly ticking time bomb. Nolan didn't explain. He demanded the exact physical address of the mountain property. The liquidator scribbled the rural highway marker onto a sticky note, explaining that it was a sprawling, heavily wooded 50-acre farm located nearly 20 miles up the steep, winding mountain pass. Nolan grabbed the note, ran out of the warehouse, and jumped back into his vehicle. He did not call the local West Virginia police. He knew that explaining a 21-year-old out-of-state cold case to a rural dispatcher would result in hours of bureaucratic delays, waiting for warrants and deputies to slowly mobilize. Hazel absolutely did not have hours left. Nolan aggressively slammed his foot onto the gas pedal, his tires screeching against the frozen asphalt as he sped toward the dark, towering peaks of the Appalachian Mountains. The drive up the winding mountain pass was incredibly treacherous. The narrow, unpaved logging road was heavily covered in thick layers of black ice and packed winter snow. The dense, towering pine trees blocked out the pale morning sun, plunging the winding road into deep, heavy shadows. Nolan gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned completely white. He threw his vehicle around the dangerous curves, completely ignoring the steep, terrifying drop-offs just inches from his tires. After 30 agonizing minutes of climbing higher into the absolute isolation of the mountain, Nolan finally saw a rusted metal gate blocking a long, overgrown dirt driveway. Hanging on the gate was a faded wooden sign that read, "Private property, no trespassing." Nolan didn't stop. He accelerated his vehicle, driving the heavy front bumper of his car violently through the rusted metal gate. The heavy chain snapped with a loud crack, and the gate swung wildly open. Nolan drove up the long, winding dirt path until he reached a massive clearing surrounded by dense, silent woods. Sitting in the center of the clearing was a large, deeply weathered, 2-story wooden farmhouse. The roof was sagging under the weight of the winter snow, and the windows were dark and filthy. The estate liquidators had parked a large commercial dumpster in the front yard, leaving massive muddy tire tracks in the frozen grass. Nolan slammed his car into park, grabbed a heavy steel tire iron from his trunk to use as a weapon, and sprinted toward the front porch of the farmhouse. He violently kicked the front door open, stepping into the dark, freezing interior of the house. The liquidators had already cleared out most of the furniture, leaving the house feeling like an empty, echoing wooden shell. "Hazel," Nolan roared at the top of his lungs, his voice tearing with raw, desperate panic. "Hazel, I'm here." The only answer was the quiet howling of the winter wind, blowing through the broken front door. Nolan began to systematically, violently tear the farmhouse apart. He sprinted through the empty living room, kicking open closet doors and smashing the drywall with his heavy tire iron, desperately searching for any hidden rooms or secret compartments. He ran up the creaking wooden staircase, checking every single empty bedroom on the second floor. He found absolutely nothing. He ran back down to the main floor and found a heavy wooden door leading into the basement. He flipped the light switch, but the electricity to the property had been entirely shut off. Nolan pulled a small tactical flashlight from his jacket pocket and descended into the dark, freezing cellar. The basement was completely filled with Arthur Pendleton's sick, twisted photographic equipment. There were heavy metal developing trays, old and larger machines, and thousands of chemical bottles. But as Nolan swept his bright white flashlight across the concrete walls of the basement, his heart sank. There were no hidden doors. There were no locked cages. The basement was exactly what it appeared to be, a darkroom. Nolan stumbled back up the wooden stairs, his chest heaving with exhaustion and terror. He walked out onto the back porch of the farmhouse, staring out at the sprawling 50-acre property completely covered in dense pine trees and thick winter snow. If Arthur Pendleton had hidden a young woman on this property for 21 years, he wouldn't have kept her inside the main house. The estate liquidators had spent the last 2 weeks packing up boxes in the living room and clearing out the attic. If Hazel had been inside the farmhouse, the workers would have found her immediately. Arthur had hidden her somewhere else, somewhere completely detached, heavily soundproofed, and entirely invisible from the main road. Nolan stepped off the back porch, sinking knee-deep into the freezing, packed snow. He began to frantically march across the sprawling backyard, sweeping his flashlight across the dense tree line. He checked the dilapidated wooden barn, finding nothing but rotting tractor tires and rusted farm equipment. He checked a small, collapsing gardening shed, finding it entirely empty. A massive, suffocating wave of despair began to wash completely over Nolan. The property was massive. Finding a hidden bunker under 50 acres of freezing snow without specialized ground-penetrating radar equipment was geographically impossible. But as Nolan stood in the center of the freezing, silent clearing, desperate and praying for a miracle, his highly observant, analytical mind noticed a single, microscopic detail that broke the natural pattern of the winter landscape. Running out of the back of the farmhouse, completely buried under the thick snow, was a thick, black industrial power cable. Nolan dropped to his knees in the freezing snow, ignoring the bitter cold soaking through his jeans. He used his bare hands to frantically dig through the snowdrift, exposing the heavy black electrical wire. The wire did not run toward the wooden barn, and it did not run toward the gardening shed. It ran directly across the clearing, disappearing into a massive, steep wall of solid gray rock at the very edge of the property line. Nolan grabbed his heavy steel tire iron and sprinted across the deep snow, following the buried power cable directly to the massive rock wall. As he approached the heavy stone face of the mountain, the terrifying brilliance of Arthur's hiding place was finally exposed. Built directly into the natural, solid rock of the mountainside, perfectly camouflaged by heavy, overgrown thorny brush and thick layers of winter ice, was a massive, heavy iron door. It was a subterranean root cellar, heavily reinforced and completely buried deep within the earth. It was completely invisible unless someone knew exactly where to look. The heavy iron door was secured by 3 massive, modern steel padlocks. The locks were heavily rusted on the outside, but they were firmly, entirely locked. Nolan felt a massive surge of pure, violent adrenaline shoot completely through his veins. If Arthur had died of a sudden heart attack 3 weeks ago, he had never come back to unlock these heavy steel padlocks. The person inside was completely trapped in the dark. Nolan did not hesitate. He raised the heavy steel tire iron high above his head and brought it down violently against the first brass padlock. A loud, sharp metallic crack echoed across the silent mountain, but the lock held. Nolan roared with a primal, desperate fury, striking the heavy padlock again and again, utilizing absolutely every ounce of his physical strength. On the 5th massive strike, the thick brass mechanism finally shattered, falling heavily into the snow. He moved instantly to the 2nd padlock, smashing it violently until the steel arm snapped in half. He destroyed the 3rd padlock, completely tearing the skin off his knuckles in the freezing cold, entirely ignoring the pain. With all 3 locks broken, Nolan grabbed the heavy, rusted iron handle of the massive cellar door. He planted his tactical boots firmly in the snow and pulled backward with everything he had. With a loud, deep, mechanical groan that sounded like a dying animal, the heavy iron door slowly swung open, tearing through the overgrown vines and ice. A rush of incredibly stale, freezing air blew up out of the dark hole, smelling of damp earth, rusted metal, and profound, total isolation. Nolan shined his bright tactical flashlight down into the dark abyss. Descending straight into the absolute darkness of the earth was a long, steep, narrow staircase made of carved gray stone. Nolan gripped his steel tire iron tightly in his right hand, keeping his flashlight raised in his left. He stepped over the threshold, slowly descending the freezing stone steps, moving deep into the cold, silent belly of the mountain. The silence inside the subterranean corridor was incredibly heavy, pressing violently against his eardrums. He walked down nearly 20 feet into the earth, stepping off the final stone stair onto a smooth, damp concrete floor. He shined his light down the dark, narrow hallway. At the very end of the corridor stood a massive, solid steel containment door. It was the kind of heavy, industrial vault door completely impossible to open from the inside. There was absolutely no handle on the interior side. The door was secured from the hallway by a massive, sliding external iron deadbolt. Set directly into the center of the heavy steel door at eye level was a tiny, narrow viewing panel made of thick, scratched bulletproof glass. Nolan stepped forward, his heart pounding a frantic, deafening rhythm in his chest. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely hold the flashlight steady. He walked directly up to the heavy steel door, standing entirely alone in the freezing, pitch-black underground hallway. He slowly raised his flashlight, shining the bright white beam directly through the tiny, scratched glass viewing window. The light cut deeply into the pitch-black cell on the other side of the heavy steel door. For a terrifying, agonizing second, the room appeared entirely empty. It was a small, concrete box. There was a small mattress on the floor, a metal bucket, and dozens of empty plastic water bottles scattered across the gray stone. But then, the beam of his flashlight caught something moving in the deepest, darkest corner of the freezing concrete cell. And echoing from the other side of the thick steel door, completely muffled by the heavy armor but undeniably real, came a sound that made the breath permanently leave Nolan's lungs. The muffled, rhythmic sound echoing from the deepest corner of the pitch-black concrete cell completely shattered the agonizing silence of the underground hallway. It was a faint, desperate, incredibly weak tapping against the stone floor, followed by the quiet, ragged sound of someone struggling to draw a breath. Nolan did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. He dropped his heavy steel tire iron onto the concrete floor, grabbed the rusted metal handle of the massive sliding external deadbolt, and pulled backward with absolutely every ounce of his physical strength. The heavy iron mechanism shrieked violently, grinding against decades of accumulated rust, but Nolan's sheer, desperate adrenaline forced it open. He threw his shoulder aggressively against the solid steel door and pushed it wide open. A wave of freezing, stale air rushed out of the cell. Nolan stepped over the threshold, his hands shaking violently as he raised his bright tactical flashlight, casting the white beam into the dark, incredibly confined space. Huddled completely in the farthest corner of the freezing room, sitting on a thin, filthy mattress with her knees pulled tightly to her chest, was a woman. She was 27 years old, but she was incredibly, dangerously frail. After 21 days of being completely abandoned in the dark following Arthur Pendleton's sudden death, her body was completely shutting down. Her skin was a pale, ghostly white from decades without natural sunlight. She was wearing a faded, oversized gray sweatshirt, shivering uncontrollably in the freezing dampness of the underground root cellar. When the blinding light of the flashlight hit the walls, she raised her trembling, skeletal hands, desperately shielding her highly sensitive eyes. She squeezed her eyes shut, turning her head away, completely terrified, expecting the cruel monster who kept her in the dark to shout commands at her. Nolan immediately dropped his flashlight onto the concrete floor so the beam pointed away from her face, casting a gentle, ambient glow across the small room. He fell completely to his knees on the freezing stone, entirely ignoring the cold. "Hazel," Nolan whispered, his voice cracking into a raw, devastating sob. The frail woman in the corner completely froze. She hadn't heard her real name spoken out loud in 21 years. Arthur had always refused to use it, trying to completely erase her identity. She slowly lowered her trembling hands, blinking rapidly as her eyes adjusted to the dim light. She looked at the strange, frantic man kneeling on the floor of her cell. Nolan was now 31 years old. He was a grown man, broad-shouldered and heavily stubbled. She did not immediately recognize him. Nolan saw the absolute, primal fear in her wide green eyes. He reached into his heavy winter coat, his hands trembling so violently he could barely operate the zipper. He pulled out the thick, clear, hard plastic protective sleeve and held it up in the soft light of the flashlight. "I brought your magic shield," Nolan choked out, heavy tears completely flooding his eyes and spilling down his cheeks. "I promised it would protect you from the dark. It's me, Hazel, it's Nolan. I found Barnaby. I came to take you home." Hazel stared at the mint-condition Ken Griffey Jr. rookie baseball card. She stared at the man's face. The massive, heavy wall of pure survival instinct she had built to endure 21 years of absolute darkness finally, completely shattered. The memory of the peach-colored bedroom, the violent thunderstorm, and the big brother who had promised to keep her safe rushed back with a staggering, undeniable clarity. A sound of raw, agonizing, overwhelming emotional release tore from her dry, cracked throat. "Nolan," she whispered, her voice incredibly weak and fragile. Nolan lunged forward, crawling across the freezing concrete floor, and gently pulled his sister into his arms. Hazel collapsed entirely against his chest, wrapping her frail, trembling arms tightly around his neck. Nolan buried his face in her long, messy hair, holding her securely as they both wept with a desperate, crushing intensity. Every single ounce of guilt Nolan had carried for 2 decades instantly melted away in the freezing underground cell. He had finally fulfilled his promise. He had protected his little sister. Nolan took off his heavy winter coat, wrapping it tightly around Hazel's shivering shoulders. He gently scooped her up into his arms, utterly heartbroken by how incredibly light she felt. He carried her out of the freezing concrete cell, walking slowly up the steep, narrow stone staircase, and emerged from the dark root cellar into the blinding, bright white landscape of the West Virginia winter. For the very first time in over 7,600 days, Hazel Gallagher looked up and saw the open sky. She buried her face into Nolan's warm shoulder, completely overwhelmed by the brilliant sunlight reflecting off the snow. Nolan placed her gently into the heated passenger seat of his vehicle, reclined the chair, and drove aggressively down the treacherous mountain pass, speeding directly toward the nearest county hospital. When they arrived at the rural emergency room, the medical staff immediately rushed Hazel into a secure trauma bay. She was severely malnourished, dangerously dehydrated, and suffering from profound shock, but the doctors assured Nolan that her sheer, unstoppable will to live had kept her organs from failing. She was going to survive. While the medical team stabilized his sister, Nolan stood in the quiet hospital hallway and dialed the number he had spent 21 years praying he would eventually dial. He called his parents. Thomas and Evelyn Gallagher were sitting in their small countryside home in Virginia when the telephone rang. When Evelyn answered, Nolan didn't waste time trying to soften the blow. His voice broke as he spoke into the receiver. "Mom, I found her. She's alive. I have her." The telephone slipped directly from Evelyn's hand, crashing heavily onto the wooden floorboards. Thomas rushed into the room, picking up the phone and hearing his son weeping on the other end of the line. The 21 years of agonizing, torturous waiting, the thousands of sleepless nights, and the suffocating weight of an empty home completely culminated in this single, impossible miracle. Thomas and Evelyn drove across state lines with a frantic, desperate intensity. When they finally arrived at the West Virginia hospital, a team of nurses gently guided them down a quiet, brightly lit corridor toward the secure recovery wing. Evelyn stopped at the heavy wooden doorway. Her entire body was shaking so violently she could barely stand. Thomas wrapped his arm around her waist, supporting her as they slowly pushed the door open. The hospital room was kept very dim to protect Hazel's highly sensitive eyes. Hazel was sitting up in the hospital bed, hooked up to intravenous fluids and wrapped in warm white blankets. When the door opened, she turned her head. The visual dissonance was incredibly profound. Evelyn and Thomas had spent 21 years mourning a tiny, 6-year-old girl with a missing front tooth. The person sitting in the hospital bed was a quiet, fragile 27-year-old woman. But as Evelyn looked deeply into those large, expressive green eyes, she absolutely, undeniably saw her little girl. "Hazel," Evelyn whispered, the breath leaving her lungs in a heavy, agonizing rush. "Mommy," Hazel breathed, her voice cracking as heavy tears spilled completely over her pale cheeks. Evelyn and Thomas ran to the side of the hospital bed, throwing their arms around their daughter, completely breaking down. Hazel wrapped her thin arms around her parents' necks, holding them with a fierce, desperate strength. They wept openly, lost in an ocean of profound, indescribable relief and joy. The years of forced separation, the agonizing silence, and the cold concrete walls completely melted away in the warmth of that beautiful, unbreakable family embrace. In the days and weeks that followed the rescue, as Hazel slowly began the long, difficult process of physical and psychological recovery, the complete, horrifying truth of the 1994 disappearance was finally, entirely explained. The state police executed a massive search warrant on Arthur Pendleton's 50-acre mountain property. Inside the darkroom of the main farmhouse, they discovered dozens of meticulously kept leather journals and thousands of photographs. The journals completely documented Arthur's sick, highly organized crimes. He was a deeply disturbed predator who became obsessed with the concept of preserving innocence. He had watched the Gallagher family from his high ridge, memorized their routines, and executed the brilliant decoy operation with Elias Cobb's stolen commercial van to completely blind the Salem Police Department. But the journals also revealed exactly how Hazel's handmade corduroy teddy bear had ended up in the cardboard box of miscellaneous toys at the estate liquidation warehouse. Arthur had treated Hazel like a captive pet, bringing her food, water, and books, but refusing to ever let her see the sun. A few months before he died, in a twisted display of arrogant control, Arthur had decided that Hazel was becoming too old for childhood toys. He had walked into the concrete cell, taken Barnaby the bear away from her, and thrown the toy into a cardboard box in the attic of his farmhouse, intending to eventually burn it. Arthur had absolutely no idea that years earlier, when he had accidentally left a piece of his junk mail near the cellar door, Hazel had secretly stolen the property tax notice. Knowing that the Ken Griffey Jr. baseball card was already hidden in the invisible Velcro pocket, she had folded the tax document and stuffed it deep behind the hard plastic sleeve. She had created a brilliant, completely undetectable distress signal, trusting her big brother's promise that the magic shield would protect her. When Arthur threw the bear into the box, he unwittingly preserved the exact geographical coordinates of his own secret bunker. When Arthur suffered a massive, fatal heart attack in his farmhouse kitchen, the bunker was permanently locked. The estate liquidators cleared the house, totally unaware of the hidden root cellar buried in the rock wall outside. Hazel had been left entirely alone in the pitch-black darkness. She survived for 3 agonizing weeks by relying on her incredible intelligence. She found a leftover case of plastic water bottles Arthur had left in the corner of the cell, and she meticulously, desperately rationed every single drop of water, sitting in the dark and focusing entirely on the memory of her brother's face to keep her mind from breaking. Because Arthur Pendleton was already dead, there was no highly publicized trial. The monster had escaped human justice, but his meticulously built fortress of deception had been completely destroyed. The county brought in heavy excavation machinery, completely bulldozing the subterranean root cellar, filling the dark, freezing concrete box with tons of solid gravel and earth, completely erasing the nightmare from the mountain. The recovery process for Hazel was an incredibly slow, delicate journey. Re-entering a world that had completely transformed since 1994 was a massive, overwhelming shock. She had to learn how to use a cellular phone, navigate the modern internet, and adjust to the fast-paced reality of the new century. She had to learn how to walk in the bright sunlight without shielding her eyes, and how to trust that the doors in her home would never be locked from the outside. But she was never asked to walk that difficult path alone for a single second. Evelyn, Thomas, and Nolan were right by her side, guiding her with endless patience and fiercely protecting her peace. Hazel moved into a beautiful, sunlit room in her parents' countryside home. Nolan visited every single day, bringing her coffee, sitting with her on the back porch, and slowly helping her bridge the gap between the 6-year-old girl he lost and the brave woman she had become. On a warm, beautiful Sunday morning exactly 1 year after she was rescued, the Gallagher family was sitting together on their wooden back porch. The bright autumn sun was shining warmly through the trees, casting a golden glow across the quiet backyard. Hazel was sitting in a comfortable rocking chair, wearing a thick, warm sweater. Her pale skin had finally regained its natural color, and the bright, joyful spark had slowly returned to her large green eyes. She looked out at the vibrant orange and red leaves falling gently onto the grass, enjoying the absolute, profound peace of the morning. Resting quietly on the small wooden table next to her, completely safe and perfectly preserved, was the faded brown corduroy teddy bear with the blue velvet patch. Leaning against the bear was the hard plastic sleeve containing the 1989 Ken Griffey Jr. rookie card. Nolan walked out onto the porch, handing his sister a warm mug of coffee. Hazel took the mug, smiling up at her brother with a profound, undeniable sense of gratitude. The story of the little girl who vanished during a thunderstorm, only to be found 21 years later because of a hidden clue inside a handmade teddy bear, became a defining piece of history for the Roanoke Valley. It was a terrifying reminder that absolute evil can hide in plain sight, using calculated misdirection and the quiet isolation of a mountain to mask incredible cruelty. But far more importantly, it remains an immortal, unforgettable testament to the indestructible power of family and the absolute resilience of the human spirit. A monster can lock a young woman in the dark. He can bury a concrete room under tons of stone, completely isolate her from the world, and try to erase her identity. He can believe he has permanently stolen the light. But true love, much like a handmade bear passed between siblings, cannot be broken by distance or time. The magic shield Nolan gave his sister actually worked. It didn't stop the monster from breaking into the house, but it carried the truth across 2 decades of darkness. It waited patiently in the heavy silence, survived the deepest isolation, and eventually guided her family straight to the heavy steel door. Time will eventually expose every buried secret, proving that no matter how long the night lasts, hope will always find a way to break through the concrete and finally bring you home.